Hello! Now at this stage of my Les Paul build, I needed to route an angle in my neck pocket. This definitely shouldn't be done after I've almost finished the guitar, so there aren't going to be any measurements. After I'd wedged a piece of wood in the guitar neck pocket, I could line the template up. You can see there are wedges on the bottom of the template that give the correct angle. To secure it in place, I could drill and screw it into the guitar pickup cavities so I wouldn't damage the top. I could then remove the block of wood and just apply a piece of double-sided tape to the front to stop it wobbling. Now all I had to do was route over the top and it would put the perfect neck angle on my guitar. To set the depth on the router bit, all you do is plunge into the back of the neck pocket and then route the rest of it off with the angle. Now when I unscrew the template, you can see a bit of wood at the back that just supported it. And now the angle is only very slight, but makes a big difference to the playability. Now while I was routing, I decided I could route off the neck to make it perfectly flat for the fretboard. And as you can see, I've wedged it in my router table and then held it in place with some string and a block of concrete. I again wouldn't suggest doing this at home. Now that the neck sits in the body at the right angle, it's perfectly flush where I've routed it off, and these two corners are perfectly cleared by the fretboard. I think it looks extremely good, so now I'm happy to start doing the fretwork. Here is my frets box. The gap in the middle is the same width as the neck, so it fits in tightly and clamps it at 90 degrees. And I then routed a space and an angle for Les Paul style headstocks. And here are the two slots that the saw runs through. To make these, I cut into the softwood with any size 90-degree saw, and then what you do is place the saw blade against it, and then squeeze the two hardwood blocks tightly against it, and then screwing them down. This clamps it so that the saw is perfectly at 90 degrees and held firmly in place. I then used this fret box and an 1/8 of an inch spacer that I'd sharpened in the shape of a chisel to cut a nut slot. Here I'm making a dummy nut out of a piece of wood. I route the piece of wood off flat in my router table and then wedged the spacer between my depth stop. This way, when I route over the wood a second time, the thickness left at the bottom was exactly the width of the nut. I could then cut this out, glue it to another piece of wood, and then use it like a temporary nut. To align my rulers, I could wedge the ruler against the nut so it was perfectly zeroed, and then stick it down with double-sided tape. Once I had the first one stuck on, I could stick a second one on, lining the 100 up with the 300, so that it was consistent all the way along the fretboard. What would be ideal would be to have a 3 feet long piece of steel, and then you could measure out where the frets go once with 2 rulers, and then drill the holes in the steel so that for every time you could just put it on your fretboard and have the fret positions marked out in seconds by just putting the pencil through the hole. But sadly, I had to stick the rulers on and use a Gibson fret scale, the 24 3/4 from Stuart MacDonald, and take about 20 minutes to mark all the frets out by hand. After I'd done about 5, I could take the first ruler off and carry on using the second one. Here's the fretboard after I've finally finished marking it out. I always use a small dot instead of a line, as this is much more precise. Okay, here is a standard junior hacksaw. However, the thickness of the blade is 33 thousandths and it needs to be 23. So what I did was rub it on a stone, evenly, not like this is just an example, until it took it down to a thickness of 23 thousandths. Now I could take my fret box and screw it down to the table, and because I'm only using a fretboard, not a finished neck, I have to put a block underneath and then press the fretboard in. I now put the saw in the slots to line it up with, and then hit it with a piece of wood so it gently moves it along. Then after taking a final check cut, I can screw in my clamp and make my first cut. There's one down, and I have to do the same thing another 21 times. I actually had to stop for time lapse after about 15 minutes when I got to about the 12th fret, because otherwise it would have taken too long to render. Next is trying to radius the fretboard. So I started by making a jig like this. A lot of people do it with double-sided tape, but I made a permanent one where you of course have your sanding block set in the centre of your fretboard, and then you put rails either side so it can guide the sanding block along parallel. I'd made these spacers to make sure the fretboard always went in the middle, and now my fretboard slid perfectly so I could put on some sandpaper, screw the jig down to the table, and then begin sanding. It's always a good idea to collect all of the sawdust you use when sanding so you can fill in little dinks and the ends of the frets when you fret your guitar. So this is why I have the cardboard down, and then I use a brush to collect all of the sawdust. To check my progress, I coloured in the fretboard and then sanded it a bit more. Sadly though, this highlighted the flaw in using a sanding block. The middle had been finished, yet the two ends looked as if they'd hardly been radiused at all. So I had to come up with a new, more accurate jig to do this. And that's what I'm doing next time. I'll see you then.